About a year ago, I bought these really cool Cleveland Transit System brochures dating back to 1955. As I was looking at the system map on the back of it, I noticed a section near Public Square. The legend says it's a proposed county subway. While reading through the brochure, it states, extremely important to the use of the rapid transit is the construction of a downtown subway distribution, which was overwhelmingly approved by voters in 1953 as a county bond project. Obviously, they never completed this project as Cleveland doesn't have a subway. So what was this plan and what happened? Even before this project, the earliest idea for a subway in Cleveland can be traced back to 1905 during the Johnson administration. Cleveland was experiencing immense growth, so much so that it became the sixth most populated city in the country. Like every other major city's downtown area, the quickest mode of transportation was by taking this extensive network of streetcar lines. Though the increasing number of daily streetcars was beginning to create traffic congestion around the Public Square area, leading city officials to explore underground transportation.
There was some initial discussion of a subway system for Cleveland. It never, to my knowledge, made it to the point of actually plotting where it would go, but it was a discussion they were exploring about a year after New York City opened its initial subway system. Most of the plans for subways in Cleveland were not the kinds of extensive systems like you found in a large city like New York. And in part, it's because they never got very far along in the planning to reach the point where they were going to do an elaborate system.
Although nothing stemmed from this initial idea, Cleveland has seen 9 other different subway proposals. One even involved an extensive series of loops under Public Square that would have tied into the Detroit Superior Bridge. Now hold on for a minute. Didn't this bridge have a subway underneath it? While it did have 2 subway tunnels at both ends, in actuality, it wasn't a true subway.
When a lot of people think about a Cleveland subway, they think of that undercarriage below the Detroit Superior Bridge, where there is a subway station over on under Detroit and West 25th Street. But that was never really in some ways it was not a true subway in that it didn't have heavy rail.
In the 1940s, the planning for a subway was reignited after the city of Cleveland acquired the Cleveland Railway Company, which operated all the city's streetcar lines. To administer the system, the city government formed the Cleveland Transit System, better known as CTS. As cities across the U.S. began post-war planning projects, CTS quickly drafted a comprehensive plan to modernize their fleet and phase out surface streetcar lines within city boundaries, making use of existing freight railroad right-of-ways. The resulting outcome was the opening of an east-to-west heavy rail rapid transit line in 1955. The centerpiece of the plan to be built at a later time featured a $35 million subway loop, which went to a county bond referendum.
In 1953, when Cuyahoga County voters voted by a measure of about 2-to-1 in favor of a subway system, what they were really voting for was contingent on a feasibility study that would, if successful and the need were demonstrated, would lead to spending a bond issue basically. And they would have a finite amount of time in which to do that. It was set to run out in 1960. So the plan that they were thinking about at the time was one of a few different options that had been floated going back as far as the early 1940s. There was a plan initially by a man named Walter McCarter. And that was a loop that would take the existing rapid transit system, meaning the Shaker Rapid, and they wanted to extend further lines outward from downtown ultimately, but they would run that through the Cleveland Union Terminal in the existing station underground, and then it would go in a loop around downtown. So it would distribute riders, basically. So that became nicknamed the McCarter Loop, and that was one of the inspirations for what could be done with this bond issue in 1953. There was actually a competing one that was proposed by a Chicago planner named Charles DeLue, and that became known as the DeLue-Cather Hook, because DeLue, Cather and Company was the name of his firm. So in 1953, when voters were casting their votes, they didn't know that there were different options on the table. In the Cleveland Press, they actually showed the loop. And so I think that if anyone stopped to think, what am I voting for, they were voting for a loop. And interestingly, it showed all of the arms, sort of tentacles spreading out, or spokes spreading out like a system. That was meant to tie into the still fairly new rapid transit system, which actually was on the cusp of opening right then. So some argued that this was misleading, that people thought that it was a whole system, when in fact it was just that loop underground, and the rest of it was what they were planning to do anyway, which was a rapid transit system.
Regardless of the two different proposals, there was initially resounding support for the subway.
You know, initially in the 1950s, what some people have called the growth coalition in cities, certainly Cleveland had that. It's City Hall, it's the mayor, the city council, theoretically, it's the newspapers, it's the Chamber of Commerce, it's all the growth-oriented entities in a city. So Cleveland's Growth Coalition initially loved the idea. All three of the daily newspapers, the Plain Dealer, the Press, and the News, all were in favor of a subway. I remember seeing a mention in the Cleveland News quoting someone saying that this would be Cleveland's answer to the Chicago Loop. And so they were all for it. They thought this is something that will preserve value, land values, property values downtown. It'll keep people pouring into the city. It'll relieve traffic congestion, all of that.
But no matter how well these benefits were presented, not everyone was on board with the plan. And as time went on, some started speaking out against the subway.
There was certainly an argument early on that a subway might not benefit everyone evenly, that it might accrue to the benefit of downtown interests. So that is an earlier idea, but in 1953 it's not at the forefront. It comes back, roaring back basically by the mid-1950s. And so there were a number of different detractors. The one that most people think of when they think about this sort of decade-long subway battle in the 1950s is Albert Porter, who was the Cuyahoga County engineer. And once the freeway system was getting underway in its planning, he was very much a pro-freeway guy. He was skeptical about the future of rail in cities, and saw it as, one, a waste of money, two, likely to get into major cost overruns, and three, just a terrible disruption to downtown business, because he said you're going to tear up the streets for a couple of years, and what's going to happen to all the retail activity at street level? If people can't get to the stores, that's part of the problem right now, is that traffic congestion is making it harder. Parking is a problem. So you're going to tear up the street and create what he called the battle, something like a scene from the Battle of the Marne, evoking World War I trenches. That's not a good thing. So he's the first opponent, and the most vocal.
While Porter continued his anti-subway rhetoric, he was able to prolong the bond's vote through countless debates and public surveys, and even released a 49-page report disagreeing with the feasibility study. Unfortunately for subway supporters, his keen debating skills and engineering knowledge started persuading the working class and bigwigs.
The Plain Dealer ultimately breaks with the press and goes against the subway, says that it's too risky. George Gund, who was the head of the Cleveland Trust Company, the #1 bank in Cleveland at that time. He got cold feet about it too and said, this is not a good thing for Euclid Avenue. And you started to have some fissures, out in the outlying neighborhoods. Some of the suburban governments also began to, speak out against it and pass resolutions decrying it. So things kind of begin to separate into the pro and anti-subway camps. But Porter is stoking this. He's sort of stoking the fire all along.
4 years have passed since the 1953 approval of the feasibility study, and time was running out for the 3 county commissioners to make a decision. In April 1957, a newspaper poll conducted by a local radio station revealed that a resounding 87% of the 3,000 participants now opposed the subway. By May, 2 of the commissioners were both for and against it, leaving the decision resting on the shoulders of the 3rd member.
Henry Spieth had been dead set against the subway going back to the 1940s. In fact, he had called it a hole in the ground. That was actually his dismissive way of describing it back in the 1940s, and when it came back, he was no more interested in it. Then you had Gorman, who was for it, and that left the question as to how Curry would vote. And Curry then was ultimately persuaded by Porter that the cost overruns and damage to downtown business would not be worth it, and that it didn't serve enough of the county for him to put his support behind it. So he voted against it, and it was a 2-to-1 opposition, basically, or 2-to-1 vote against the subway.
For 2 years, the plan remained dormant until a fresh burst of energy kicked off renewed interest in a subway. Contrary to its initial aim of reducing traffic congestion and addressing insufficient parking, the goal now was to bring more people downtown as Cleveland was experiencing a population decline.
By 1959, downtown has slipped. Retail sales have dropped since the mid-1950s. Some office space, especially toward the periphery of downtown, is suffering. When you also look at what the rapid transit system, as small as it had a pretty big impact on downtown, because what it did was CTS, the Cleveland Transit System, removed some of the surface lines that used to come straight into downtown to Public Square because they wanted to force people onto the rapid. So it's somewhat disingenuous. You say you need a rapid transit system, but then you have to sort of skew the situation in a way that forces people or funnels people into certain outlying stations, and then they ride the rapid down and you can declare it a success, when in fact it's just robbing another line of its ridership. Those riders would have passed by Playhouse Square, all the theaters. They would have passed by Howley's department store. They would have passed by Sterling Linder Davis department store on their way down to Public Square from the east side. So you can begin to see that interests out of 2/3 or 3/4 of a mile east of Public Square are hurting more because they're farther away from where that rapid transit station is under the terminal tower. So the farther you get away from that one point where the rapid transit works for downtown, the more concern there is with the drop-off of business. So that begins to make some people say we need to bring this idea back and do it fast, because in 1960 the bond issue is going to expire and you'll have to go back to the voters, ask permission to spend it again. So it's now or never. So the Euclid Avenue Association, which is merchants and the theater operators, the office building interests out in the Playhouse Square area, are the big drivers for the subway, along with CTS. Don Hyde, who was the general manager of CTS, is of course very much for it. And so it's really pitting those groups against each other. The Porter influenced people have not gone away. But now you have this department store feud, kind of mostly behind the scenes. What I found in researching this was that you didn't see a lot just right on the surface in the newspapers, but the Higbee's store had the benefit of being right in the terminal. They didn't think it was the best idea. It did nothing for them. At best, it's just an okay but very expensive idea. At worst, it might send people more efficiently to their competitors out in Playhouse Square. The 1959 subway plan, once that came back to the forefront, actually emerged from the 1959 downtown plan that the City Planning Commission produced. It showed, to everyone's surprise, a new version of the Hook subway. And by Hook, what I mean is it headed toward the terminal from the east side through the flats, basically. It took a turn to the right and would have gone under East 14th Street. And unlike the earlier idea for a Hook subway that DeLue had come up with in the 40s, that would have veered then off of 14th and down Huron, and then it would have connected into the Cleveland Union Terminal underground there at Ontario Street. This newer version that got drawn into the 1959 downtown plan, actually hooked off of, hence the name Hook, hooked off of East 14th Street, right where the Chandelier is today. So it would have turned under Euclid Avenue, and it would have better served the major retail shopping street of Cleveland, rather than having it run under sort of a secondary street, which is Huron. So that was the one then that was going to come up for a vote in 1959. It was very similar to the vote in 1957, but just included two different commissioners, and then one was the same, but the two different commissioners split, and Henry Spieth was still on there, and he remained against it. So it went down to defeat again in December of 1959.
Even though the subway plan faced defeat once more, it resurfaced again in the 1980s with the proposal of the dual hub corridor. This project aimed to provide rapid transit along Euclid Avenue to University Circle.
It was going to be partially a subway, basically under downtown, and it would have emerged around where East 17th Street crosses. So as it went by CSU and then eastward, it would have been above ground. It would have been light rail rather than heavy rail.
As cost estimates soared, however, RTA scaled it back to a bus rapid transit system called the Health Line, which opened in 2008. The story of how Cleveland almost got a subway is one that not a lot of people know about. That's why Mark Souther wrote an article detailing its complicated history.
I was initially interested in it just because you had this sort of major figure, Albert Porter, and just this sort of clash between Porter, who's saying freeways are the way to go, and Don Hyde of CTS saying no, rail is what we need to be doing. And I thought of it as a sort of clash of personalities and clash of visions. And it was that, but it turned out that there was so much else going on, and I found that there's such a rich story in thinking about how any kind of major infrastructure project sometimes pits people against each other based on where they are in a metropolitan area. So much of the greater Cleveland area would not have been directly served by having a downtown subway, because they'd first have to get to a rapid transit station in the first place. And we know that's still a problem today.